I grew up in a small Texas suburb called Oak Hollow, the kind of place that felt carved out of the American dream. Rows of identical houses, wide lawns that glowed gold under the evening sun, and kids who spent their days racing bikes down cul-de-sacs until the streetlights came on. In the fall of 1974, I was 11 years old, and Halloween was everything to me. Back then, it wasn't just about candy, it was about belonging. Every kid in Oak Hollow lived for that night when the whole town turned into a playground lit by jack-o'-lanterns and porch lights. My mom was big on safety. She'd check every mask strap, tie my shoelaces double tight, and warn me to stay close to my group. "You never know who's out there," she'd say. But in our little town, it was hard to imagine danger. Everyone knew everyone. There was one house, though, that always stood out. The Pattersons lived 2 doors down from us. The dad, Mr. Patterson, worked with chemicals at the refinery nearby. He had a deep voice, the kind that made you straighten up when he spoke. His wife was quiet, and their 2 kids, Tommy and little Eric, were around my age. Mr. Patterson was the kind of dad everyone respected. He volunteered at church events, helped run the neighborhood watch, and was the last guy you'd ever suspect of being off. But even back then, there was something about his smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. The Friday before Halloween, our school held its costume parade. I remember the smell of caramel popcorn in the halls, the scratchy feel of my plastic vampire mask, and how every adult in town came to watch us march. Mr. Patterson stood near the fence with a camcorder on his shoulder, filming the kids. He waved to me when I passed by. I waved back. It's strange the details your brain saves, like the fact that his hands were trembling a little, or that when I waved, he hesitated before smiling. Halloween fell on a Thursday that year, and by the time the sun dipped, Oak Hollow looked like a postcard. Orange lights in the windows, fake cobwebs stretched across bushes, and the smell of barbecue drifting from every porch. I was heading out with my friends, a small group of us dressed as monsters and superheroes. My mom snapped a Polaroid before we left, me holding my candy bag, my vampire cape fluttering behind me. In the background, you can see Mr. Patterson across the street, standing in his doorway. He was handing out candy early, smiling at the first wave of kids. If you look close, you can see that same hollow smile in the photo. Back then, I thought nothing of it. But later, when I looked at that picture again, I realized it was the last normal moment our town ever had. Because that was the year Oak Hollow stopped trusting Halloween. The year we learned that sometimes the real monsters don't wear masks at all. Halloween night arrived, crisp and electric. The sky was a deep indigo, dotted with clouds that reflected the orange glow of porch lights. I stuffed my candy bag into my backpack, zipped up my cape, and joined my friends at the end of the street. Our plan was simple: hit every house on our block before the older kids moved on to the bigger neighborhoods. The Pattersons' house was always first on our list. The porch was glowing, fog spilling from a small smoke machine their oldest kid had begged for. Mr. Patterson leaned against the doorframe, smiling, greeting each of us by name. He handed me a chocolate bar and patted my shoulder. "Be safe," he said. I laughed with my friends, tossing the candy wrapper into my bag, thinking nothing of it. That night, everything seemed normal. Kids ran in waves, ghosts floated along lawns, and laughter bounced off every house. But later that evening, things started to feel off. We were at the far end of the street near the old Henderson place, which had been abandoned for years. The windows were boarded up, cobwebs clinging to the frames like frozen fingers. A cold wind whispered through the branches, rattling the empty swing in the yard. My friends joked about ghosts, but I felt my stomach tighten. Something about the air had changed. It felt heavier, like the night was watching us. That's when I saw him again, Mr. Patterson. He wasn't on the porch this time. He was standing at the edge of his driveway, just barely in the shadows, holding a small bag of candy. He waved at us, but this time his smile didn't reach his eyes. I froze for a moment before my friends grabbed me and pulled me forward. Later, I would realize that moment was the first hint of what was coming. By 8 p.m., the neighborhood had thinned out. Most kids had moved on, and the streets were quieter. A few brave souls still roamed in small packs, costumes glowing in the streetlights. My group decided to circle back to the Patterson house one last time, just for a big finale before heading home. When we arrived, the house looked normal at first. Lights on, candy bowl on the porch, Mr. Patterson smiling in the doorway. But there was something strange about the way he was moving. Too deliberate, too practiced. He handed candy to a few of the kids who approached, then called out, "Go ahead, enjoy yourselves." But his eyes lingered in a way that made me uneasy. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe I was just tired or imagining things. We grabbed our candy and ran off to the next house. Then, the screams started. At first I thought it was part of someone's costume. Halloween, after all, is full of fake screams, but these were real, sharp, piercing, panicked. They came from across the street, from the direction of the Patterson house. I froze, my friends shouting my name. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure everyone could hear it. I turned slowly, and my stomach dropped. There was a crowd of parents and kids, all gathered near the driveway. Someone shouted that something was wrong with little Eric Patterson. I ran closer, my cape flapping behind me, ignoring the cold that had started to bite through my skin. The adults were frantic, shouting, and some were trying to carry Eric inside. But I could see it in their faces: panic, confusion, disbelief. He wasn't breathing. No one said it, but we all knew. Something terrible had happened. The rest of the night blurred. Ambulances arrived, sirens slicing through the dark. Neighbors gathered in the streets, whispering, shaking their heads. Some parents were crying, others shouted accusations, their fear and anger bouncing off the houses like a physical wall. We all talked in hushed tones, exchanging what we had seen. Every kid who had gotten candy from Mr. Patterson that night was examined, their wrappers checked. The adults whispered about poison, about chemicals, about someone's mind being twisted. The next morning, the town felt different. Oak Hollow was quieter, emptier. People didn't leave doors open, and parents walked their kids in groups. The laughter that usually echoed down the streets was gone. Halloween, once the highlight of our year, had become a shadow. Even years later, I could still remember that night, the way the porch lights glowed, the way Mr. Patterson's smile seemed just a little too sharp. It was the night Oak Hollow realized that monsters could live behind familiar faces, and that Halloween could be something darker than costumes and candy. The morning after Halloween, Oak Hollow felt like it had aged 10 years overnight. The usual smells of burnt leaves and autumn air still lingered, but now they were mixed with something heavier: grief, fear, and suspicion. Even walking down my own street felt different. Every porch, every smiling face seemed like it could hide something darker. Parents didn't let their kids trick-or-treat in groups anymore. The freedom we once took for granted vanished. Doors stayed closed, lights were left off, and the usual "Happy Halloween" greetings felt hollow. Adults whispered in neighbors' yards, the words drifting across fences. I remember hearing "poisoned candy," "chemical man," and "Oak Hollow will never be the same." At school, the story dominated every conversation. Kids traded rumors in the halls, each one more exaggerated than the last. Some said Mr. Patterson had meant to hurt all the kids. Others said it was an accident, a chemical mix-up gone wrong. Teachers tried to calm us, but even they looked shaken. I remember sitting at my desk, staring at the window, and feeling a kind of fear I had never felt before. I couldn't stop picturing the driveway that night, Mr. Patterson's smile, the frantic adults, and the sirens cutting through the dark. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see it. The town held a meeting at the community center. Parents packed the room, their eyes red and tired. Police officers explained what they knew, though the details were sparse. They said it was intentional. They said chemicals had been added to candy. They said charges would be filed soon. But no words could undo what had happened, and no explanation could erase the feeling that Halloween itself had been corrupted. For weeks afterward, my friends and I avoided the Patterson house. We walked on the opposite side of the street, crossed the street when we saw his car, and whispered to each other in fear. I started checking every candy wrapper twice, shaking out every bag like my life depended on it. Adults in town did the same. Neighbors who had once trusted each other now regarded every porch and every smile with suspicion. Even years later, that night stayed with me. I would walk past houses with pumpkins on the porch and remember the glowing driveway, the smoke spilling from the fog machine, and the sharpness of that smile. I would think of Eric, of the parents crying, and the way our childhood innocence had been stolen. Mr. Patterson was eventually arrested, tried, and convicted, though I was too young to attend any of that. The town followed the news in silence, afraid to speak too loudly about it. Halloween itself became cautious, a holiday shadowed by fear. Parents started organizing daylight trick-or-treating, checking candy obsessively, and teaching kids to never accept anything from strangers, or even neighbors. For me, Halloween changed forever that year. I still love costumes, still love candy, but that sense of carefree joy is tinged with memory. Every time I hear laughter echoing down a quiet street on October 31st, I remember Oak Hollow in 1974, and I remember the lesson we learned the hard way. Sometimes, the real monsters live behind familiar faces, and sometimes, you don't even notice them until it's too late. Maplewood was one of those towns that looked perfect on the outside. Leafy streets, old brick sidewalks, big lawns trimmed with care. Street lamps glowed softly in the early evening, and every house had pumpkins carved with the kind of precision that said the owners cared more about appearances than fun. I was 15 that year, just old enough to start noticing how quiet the streets could feel when the grown-ups weren't around. I knew all the families, knew which kids ran in packs and which stayed home reading or drawing. Life seemed normal, predictable, safe. Then there was the Bradford estate at the far end of our street. Big house, iron gate, manicured hedges, everything a teenager could envy except the stories. People whispered about the Bradfords in Maplewood, the kind of whispers that don't really have words but are heavy with unease. I had seen the daughter of the family, let's call her Maggie Bradford, at school. She was my age, a bright girl, but quiet in a way that made you notice. On Halloween Eve that year, she was supposed to go to a small party at her friend's house. From what I'd heard, it would just be a few kids in costumes, maybe some games, snacks, nothing major. My friends and I had been planning for Halloween for weeks. We carved pumpkins, made our costumes, and tested out our makeup. That night, the air smelled like burning leaves and cinnamon from the baker down the street. It was crisp and perfect, the kind of night that makes you think nothing bad could happen. I remember seeing Maggie from my bedroom window. She was laughing with friends on her porch, dressed as a ghost, and the way she held her head back carefree made me smile. Kids around her were running off to nearby houses, yelling, "Trick or treat." The streetlights cast shadows across the lawns, turning the small trees into twisted shapes that looked more like Halloween props than actual trees. I didn't know it at the time, but that would be the last time anyone would see her alive. There was a feeling in the air I couldn't name. Maybe it was the thrill of Halloween itself, or maybe it was something deeper, a sense that things weren't entirely safe. But as a 15-year-old, I shrugged it off. Life in Maplewood had been quiet, orderly, predictable. Nothing bad ever happened here. By the time night fell, the party on the Bradford estate was in full swing. From my window, I could see kids moving in and out of the porch lights, costumes glowing, laughter echoing down the street. Even the adults seemed relaxed, chatting over cups of cider, unaware that the night would not remain innocent. That night, the neighborhood felt alive, vibrant, safe. We had no idea that within hours, that feeling would shatter, leaving Maplewood changed forever. By the time night really fell, the streets of Maplewood were buzzing with kids, costumes, and the sort of excited energy only Halloween Eve could bring. From my window, I watched the glow of lanterns and jack-o'-lanterns scatter across porches like tiny fires. Kids ran from house to house, shrieking with laughter, plastic bags sagging with candy. I decided to walk to Maggie Bradford's party for a little while, just to say hi and see who was there. It wasn't far, just a few blocks down the cul-de-sac, but even that short walk felt different that night. Shadows stretched across lawns in strange ways, and the wind whispered through the trees like it was trying to tell me something. When I arrived, the party looked normal. A handful of teens were gathered on the porch, wearing costumes, bobbing for apples, laughing at silly jokes. Maggie was there, glowing in her ghost costume, surrounded by her friends. Her smile lit up the porch, brighter than any jack-o'-lantern. But there was something off. One of the older kids at the party, a boy from a nearby street, let's call him Evan, kept glancing nervously toward the edge of the yard, as if he expected someone. I asked him what was wrong. He shook his head, saying, "Nothing, just weird shadows." I laughed, pretending I wasn't thinking the same thing. The night carried on like this for a while. Music played quietly in the background, apples bobbed in the water, and kids teased each other about who had the best costume. But the air felt heavier, charged with a kind of tension I hadn't felt before. Then, Maggie disappeared. At first, no one noticed. I assumed she had gone inside to grab something. But minutes passed, and the laughter began to fade. A few of her friends went inside the house to look for her. I stood on the porch, feeling the hair on the back of my neck prickle. Something was wrong. The sound of a soft thump from the backyard caught my attention. It was subtle, almost like a branch falling, or maybe someone dropping something heavy. I told myself it was nothing, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. Then, the first scream pierced the night. It was sharp, short, and filled with terror. I froze, my hands clutching the porch railing, heart hammering in my chest. Other kids started shouting, running toward the sound. Adults came running out of the house, their faces pale, their voices rising in panic. I didn't know it at the time, but that scream changed everything. We rushed to the backyard where Maggie should have been playing games just moments before. The adults tried to shield us from what they found, but I could see enough to know it was bad. The laughter, the carefree fun, the innocence of the night, it all vanished in an instant. Neighbors came pouring into the yard. Flashlights cut through the darkness, hands shaking as people whispered to each other. Someone called the police. Someone else tried to get Maggie inside, but even then, it felt surreal, like a nightmare had swept over Maplewood, and we were trapped inside it. We were told later that she had been attacked. The details were scarce at first, shrouded in whispers and police caution. But what I remember most was the shock, the way a town that felt safe could be ripped apart in a single evening. For weeks afterward, we couldn't stop talking about it. Kids at school whispered in corners, adults whispered on front porches. Everyone remembered seeing Maggie smiling on that porch just hours before. Everyone remembered the way the night had felt, different. Halloween Eve in Maplewood had been a night of joy, but it became a night we would never forget. Shadows in the yard, strange noises, nervous glances, it all became part of the memory, an invisible scar etched into the town. From that night on, Maplewood changed. Streets weren't as bright, laughter wasn't as loud, and the memory of that scream haunted every Halloween Eve thereafter. The day after Halloween Eve, Maplewood felt like a different town. The crisp autumn air was still there, the scent of burning leaves lingered, but everything else had changed. The joy and excitement that usually filled the streets had been replaced with silence, tension, and the kind of whispers that crawl along fences and through open windows. At school, the hallways felt heavier. Kids who had run freely the night before now huddled in small groups, trading fragmented rumors. "Did you hear what happened at the Bradford house?" one would whisper. "They say," but no one said more. We all felt it in our bones. Something dark had slipped into our perfect little town. I remember sitting in my history class, staring out the window at the falling leaves and trying to make sense of it. I couldn't. Maplewood had always been safe. Kids rode bikes without helmets, doors stayed unlocked, and adults trusted each other. Now, everything felt fragile. I kept imagining that scream over and over, echoing through the trees and down the streets. The police investigation moved slowly at first. Officers walked the streets, asking questions, interviewing neighbors, trying to piece together what had happened. The adults in town were pale, their voices low, their eyes darting nervously at anyone passing by. People who had once greeted each other warmly now gave tight-lipped nods. Everyone seemed afraid, but afraid of what? And of whom? We were told later that the attack had been intentional, though at first, no one wanted to say it out loud. The Bradfords were a quiet, wealthy family, and speculation about who could have done such a thing spread like wildfire. But nobody dared speak the full truth openly. It was easier to whisper in corners, to lock doors, to hold our children close. Halloween that year was canceled in Maplewood. Porch lights stayed off, pumpkins rotted in the cold air, and the streets were empty. For years afterward, parents walked their kids from house to house, holding their hands tightly. Adults checked candy obsessively, examined every wrapper, and warned their children to never go near strange houses or even familiar ones if they felt the slightest unease. I remember one October, a few years later, when I walked past the Bradford estate. The house was quiet, empty, overgrown weeds curling along the walkway. The iron gate creaked when I pushed it open, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. I thought about that night, about Maggie smiling on the porch, about the laughter that had been ripped away. And I realized the town itself still carried the weight of that scream. Maplewood had learned a lesson that Halloween Eve, that sometimes horror doesn't come from costumes or masks, or even the stories we tell around bonfires. Sometimes it comes from within the walls we trust, from the people we think we know. And the scars from that night didn't fade with time. They stayed, like shadows at the edges of our vision, reminders that safety can vanish in an instant. Even now, every Halloween Eve, when the wind whistles through the trees and shadows stretch across the lawns, I remember that night. I remember the feeling of fear creeping into our lives, the uncertainty that settled over the town, and the fragile, fleeting nature of innocence. Maplewood changed forever that night. And so did I. Because once you've seen how quickly a perfect town can turn into a nightmare, you can't unsee it. I'll never forget that night. It started like any other Halloween weekend. Crisp air, leaves crunching underfoot, the smell of smoke and cider in the neighborhoods. I'd been invited to a party at a mansion in Crestwood, a town not far from the city, but quiet enough that you felt you were stepping into someone else's world when you arrived there. The house belonged to a guy we all called Derek, who had rented it for the weekend through one of those online platforms. Derek wasn't someone I knew well, but the Instagram flyer promised the party of the year, and by 16, you don't hesitate when something like that comes along. The pictures showed a massive house, multiple floors, glowing lights, and a pool in the backyard. In my mind, it was paradise. When I arrived, the street was already buzzing. Kids and teens in costumes milled about, talking, laughing, showing off elaborate masks and makeup. Music thumped from the mansion even before I reached the front gate, a low bass that made your chest vibrate. I remember looking up at the house, its windows lit like amber lanterns, and feeling my stomach fill with excitement. It felt bigger than life, a Halloween fantasy made real. Inside, it was even wilder. The mansion had rooms full of people, decorations everywhere, neon lights bouncing off every surface. Some kids had brought fog machines, others carried glowing sticks. I remember seeing someone dressed as a skeleton dancing on a staircase railing while a group of vampires crowded near the kitchen. It was chaotic, intoxicating, electric. For the first hour, everything felt perfect. I grabbed a soda, wandered through the rooms with friends, and laughed at costumes. We didn't know most of the other kids in the house, but it didn't matter. The night was ours. The mansion felt alive. Every shadow seemed to hide a laugh, every doorway a new adventure. But the thing about those kinds of nights, you don't notice the little things until they pile up. A flicker of movement in a dark corner that didn't belong. A laugh that sounded wrong, too sharp, too sudden. The way some kids clustered near the back doors, whispering in ways you didn't understand. Looking back, those were the warnings. Tiny cracks in the night's perfection. And like all warnings, we ignored them. The air in the house was thick with heat and excitement. Someone turned on the pool lights, and the water glimmered green and blue. Costumes reflected in the tiles like ghosts dancing on the floor. Music pulsed in waves, the kind that made your head spin after a while. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I had a feeling of unease, but I shook it off. I thought it was nerves, or maybe just the overwhelming chaos. After all, it was Halloween, and the night was meant to feel larger than life. No one could have known how quickly it would all collapse. It started as a whisper, a sound from the back of the mansion, barely audible over the music and laughter. At first, I thought someone had dropped a cup or slammed a door, but then came the screams. High-pitched, panicked, impossible to ignore. I froze. My friends shouted my name, grabbing my arm, pulling me toward the nearest doorway. I could see kids running, some in costumes, some stumbling over furniture, terrified expressions hidden behind masks. The music had stopped abruptly somewhere in the chaos, leaving only the echo of shouts and the pounding of feet. The first shots came in bursts, sharp and deafening. I remember thinking they were fireworks at first. How could anyone fire a gun here? It didn't make sense, but the smell hit me next, acrid and metallic, and I realized with a gut punch that this was real. Panic spread like wildfire. Kids were screaming, diving for cover under tables, behind couches, even in the bathrooms. I grabbed my friends and ran, weaving through the chaos. The mansion that had been magical, glowing, alive just moments ago, was now a cage of terror. Every doorway we passed seemed like it could be an exit or a trap. I saw someone fall near the stairs and another kid screaming as they were shoved to the ground. People tripped over each other, knocking over decorations, spilling drinks, and scattering plastic pumpkins like debris in a war zone. The music's bass was gone, replaced by screams, shouts, and the occasional crack of more gunfire. I remember thinking I might die. My heart felt like it would explode from my chest. The air was thick with smoke, the flashing lights from phones and emergency exit signs slicing through the darkness. People were shouting directions, but no one knew which way to go. Every corridor, every stairwell felt like a trap. Somehow, we made it to the back doors. The night air hit me like a punch in the face, cold and electric. I could hear sirens in the distance, but they felt impossibly far away. Kids were running past us, costumes torn, faces streaked with tears, screaming for parents or friends. I grabbed my friends and bolted down the driveway, praying that no one would chase us. The screams didn't stop. Even after we were outside, we could hear people trapped inside crying for help, shouting, begging. I didn't want to look back, but I couldn't stop my eyes from glancing at the mansion one last time. Windows were smashed, lights flickered, shadows darted inside. What had been a dream house just an hour ago was now a nightmare. The police arrived in waves. Red and blue lights painted the street, cutting across terrified faces. Officers were shouting orders, trying to direct kids away from the house, trying to calm those who were too shaken to move. Parents were everywhere, screaming, crying, hugging their children. I remember thinking about the thin line between safety and horror. One minute, you're at the party of the year, surrounded by friends and laughter. The next, your world is turned upside down, and there's nothing you can do but run and hope to survive. Even as we were led to a safe area, my mind kept replaying everything: the smell, the sound, the sheer chaos. The mansion's glowing windows from earlier were burned into my memory, now tainted with terror. That night, Halloween was no longer about fun or costumes. It was about surviving and watching how quickly life could turn into something you didn't understand. The morning after the chaos, Crestwood felt like a town that had lost its innocence. The mansion stood at the end of the street, dark, boarded up, and eerily quiet. The flashing lights and screaming had faded, but the fear lingered like a fog over every lawn, every porch, every sidewalk. I couldn't sleep that night. I kept replaying every sound, every movement, the screams, the gunfire, the way friends had been shoved and tripped, the panic in their eyes. It wasn't just the horror of what had happened inside the mansion. It was the sudden realization that life could change in an instant, that safety was an illusion. The town itself changed. Police blocked off streets, helicopters hovered overhead, and news vans swarmed Crestwood like locusts. Parents refused to let their kids leave the house. Social media buzzed endlessly with speculation, rumors, and fear. People who had been at the party were silent, some too traumatized to speak, others speaking in fits and fragments. I remember talking to my friends days later. None of us wanted to go outside. We avoided the streets, avoided talking about the party, and avoided each other. Every conversation felt haunted by the memory of that night. We were teenagers, and yet we had been forced to see what panic, chaos, and terror looked like up close. Investigations followed. Authorities questioned everyone who had been at the mansion. Statements were recorded, videos collected, evidence cataloged. The news reported numbers: injured, wounded, dead, but those numbers didn't capture what we felt. They couldn't capture the echoing screams, the way the mansion had seemed alive one moment and a trap the next. Crestwood tried to move on. The mansion remained empty, a scar on the street. Halloween that year was canceled entirely. Porch lights stayed off, costumes stayed in closets, and kids stayed inside. Even years later, parents were wary of parties, strangers, and online rentals. Every Halloween, the memory of that night returned like a shadow, reminding us that fun could turn to fear in an instant. For me, the lesson was personal. I learned that safety is fragile, that chaos can erupt anywhere, and that the moments of joy we take for granted are fleeting. Every time I hear the beat of music too loud, the laughter of teens at night, or see a mansion glowing in neon lights, I remember that night on Crestwood Drive. I remember running, screaming, and the overwhelming fear that consumed everyone inside. And I remember the faces of my friends, the ones who survived and the ones who didn't, etched into my mind forever. That Halloween was supposed to be a celebration, it became a lesson, a warning, a memory that haunts every year when the air turns crisp, leaves fall, and shadows stretch long across the streets. Because some nights, some places, some parties aren't meant to be fun, and sometimes you don't realize it until it's too late.